Well, welcome to the Dylan Thomas Birthplace for its first winter event that we're holding. We've got a very varied programme for you in the parlour. First of all, we're going to kick off with Iqbal, our poet in residence, and then we're going to hand over the stage to Jeff Towns and Alun Gibbard to talk about the new book that Jeff has published. So, hope you all enjoyed being at the birthplace. I know we've got people from California, two people from California, one from Australia, and people from all over the UK as well. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Iqbal.
Thank you, Jeff. Good evening, everybody. It's an absolute privilege to be reading a few poems at the birthplace this evening with Alun and Jeff. I'll just keep my slot as short as possible because this is the main event next to me. But I thought I'd read a few poems by Dylan Thomas to celebrate his work and his words, and then a few poems of my own. So about 4 or 5 poems of Dylan. But as a poet in residence, it's an absolute privilege to be part of his story in some way. As a poet, I'm absolutely entranced by his work, his craftsmanship. And what I love about his words is it's essentially the lyricism, the sense of scripture and light that comes through. And it's a real homage to his roots as well as, and you know, just a poet in his own right. So the first poem I'm going to read, I'm sure Jeff will be pleased with this, is my favourite poem of all time. It's called Fern Hill. It was written in 1945, just after the war, and it's filled with light and pain and melancholy. And I think it's just an absolute wondrous piece of work. Now, as I was young and easy, under the apple boughs, about the lilting house and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry time let me hail and climb, golden in the heydays of his eyes. And honoured among wagons I was prince of the apple towns. And once below a time I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns, about the happy yard and singing as the farm was home, in the sun that is young once only, time let me play and be, golden in the mercy of his means. And green and golden I was huntsman and herdsman. The calves sang to my horn, the foxes on the hills barked clear and cold, and the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams. All the sun long it was running. It was lovely. The hay fields high as the house. The tunes from the chimneys, it was air and playing, lovely and watery, and fire, green as grass. And nightly under the simple stars as I rode to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the night jars flying with the ricks, and the horses flashing into the dark. And then to awake, and the farm like a wanderer white, with the dew come back, the cock on his shoulder. It was all shining. It was Adam and maiden. The sky gathered again, and the sun grew round that very day. So it must have been after the birth of the simple light in the first spinning place. The spellbound horses walking warm out of the whinnying green stable onto the fields of praise. And honoured among foxes and pheasants by the gay house, under the new made clouds and happy as the heart was long, in the sun born over and over, I ran my heedless ways. My wishes raced through the house high hay, and nothing I cared my sky blue trades the time allows in all his tuneful turning, so few and such morning songs, before the children, green and golden, follow him out of grace. Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days that time would take me, up to the swallow-fronged loft by the shadow of my hand, in the moon that is always rising, nor that riding to sleep, I should hear him fly with the high fields and wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. So, I mean, that's just such a magical poem, and like Dylan's work, it's so magical, it just needs to be read. You need to feel those words coming off the page. Another poem I thought I'd read, which I wouldn't normally read this, but I think it's just such a contrast to that particular piece. It's called A Refusal to Mourn the Death by Fire of a Child in London. I mean, the language of this is in such contrast because it doesn't flow in that way. It almost feels like it's somebody describing a traumatic event and almost immediately in the aftermath of that trying to put it into words, and it becomes very disjointed and almost at times hard to follow. And the irony is, it's a poem in which the wordsmith is lost for words. So anyway, I'll read the poem. I won't label the poem. It is full of paradoxes. For instance, never until, that sort of thing is peppered the poem. So it's deliberately kind of mentally confusing. Never until the mankind making, bird, beast, and flower fathering, and all humbling darkness, tells with silence the last light breaking, and the still hour is come of the seed tumbling in harness. And I must enter again the round Zion of the water bead, and the synagogue of the ear of corn shall I let pray the shadow of a sound, or sow my salt seed in the least valley of sackcloth to mourn the majesty and burning of the child's death. I shall not murder the mankind of her going with a grave truth, nor blaspheme down the stations of the breath with any further elegy of innocence and youth. Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter, robed in the long friends, the grains beyond age, the dark veins of her mother, secret by the unmourning water of the writhing Thames. After the first death, there is no other. Thank you. I'll just read a couple more. One of the poems I think I'll read, I haven't really read this out loud amongst friends before, but it's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. I mean, it's probably the world's best villanelle, and it's a poem of grief for his father. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words have forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last way by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late, they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Brave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height. Curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Thank you. I'll leave that there. I shall read two more poems. These are my own. It's nice to be able to contribute some of your own work as a current poet.
Quite right.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. So I was going to do three, but I'll read two. The first one, I think, is called Onyx. The world is weeping, and I am a speck fired from the void. Onyx, burning on a rainbow of light. I am manifest, yet the sun falls from the sky. Weeks become days of contradictions. Hours stretch to endless lengths of idleness. Eating, a sideshow on life's bullet train to nothingness. Tenements were doorways to a new world, unlocking them a gift from God. But I see smoke and mirrors, a Grenville of towers stacked like gravestones. I watch the television like a rocket man stuck to his seat, a cosmonaut in a wreck of cells and half-truths, my mind shaking in its own capsule. I drift, tether myself to Shiva and watch, stars filling my synapses. Each burst a reminder of the world we fail to inhabit, yet glowing, godlike. Sleep is a blunt instrument to batter life into submission, a hiding place from the monsters, colossi, willing us to submit. I don't. I watch the rain and see angels fall into earth, multitudes of men limping like mad dogs, mongrels, rabid and blind, Methuselahs waiting for Lamech. I feel Earth's gravity pinning me to the spot. I look up and see clouds moving like thunder, menacing and hateful, saturnine, brooding. Sometimes I sit on the pavement, draw a cigarette and watch the unemployed collect paychecks like pilgrims from the Holy Sepulchre. Other times I wait at the Tav, a sanctuary where evil is distilled, an alembic filtering each glass that works its own alchemy, its own magic. I remember Tea Cozy Pete dragging his bag across town, a reminder of everything we did, too hateful to pass him a few coins. I watch the ruins of our town and think the bombers were right to come. Now I look back and see that everyone was afraid, even before the war. Thank you. I do write cheery poetry. that obviously isn't perhaps going on the theme of the Child in London, but from that period, I'll finish with a poem called Bodhi. The name Bodhi is short for Bodhisattva, from the Sanskrit meaning enlightened being. Originally, I wrote this poem for Tony Beddoe in 2018 for the Socialist Health Organization to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the creation of the NHS. It took jackboots and jaw to awaken the Bodhi, a hobnailed, bullying, militarized madness of total war, reckless nihilism. But out of the darkness came the light. Adam, Moses, shepherding the weak, recreating life, a minister for health, a bodhisattva born in the beginnings of the brain and the furnace of war, protector, preacher for a flock in turmoil. For every Buddha, every Bevan follows the same path, the same struggle, the care of the sick, the infirm, the vulnerable, call it Dharma, call it love, call it hope, call it the NHS. Refashioning the world from the shards of war, doctors from bullets, nurses from chaos, midwives from death, porters from bombs, hope from despair. Like a sermon from the Tredegar Mount, the National Health Service Act, a book of Genesis, July 5th, 1948. And like all great stories, the end is always nigh. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, and hello to everybody out there in Zoom land as well. And I just say at the beginning that we will be taking questions. So if you have questions out there, those of you on Zoom, if you put them in chat as the evening progresses, then when it comes to Q&As, Dominic here will be able to read out any questions that you have submitted. Okay, so just something to keep in mind for you out there. Those of you in here, the old-fashioned way, stick your hand up. You don't even have to do that. Just ask the question. I'll start with a good old pub quiz question, which is not a huge amount to do with the theme of the evening, but I'll throw it in anyway. Who are the only two people in the world, if not even further afield, who have won an Oscar and a Nobel Prize for Literature? I love that silence. It means it's kind of working. And you can, obviously, if you have the answer up there, use the chat. And Dom will officiate. Only two people have ever won an Oscar.
Bob Dylan.
Well, that's a good start. Thank you for that. Yeah. What did he win his Oscar for?
Literature.
No, he won his Oscar.
Oh, it's also
Not the song, John.
A song?
No, it's that one in the Big Lebowski.
No. It's the film is The Wonder Boys.
Yeah.
And the song is Things Must Change.
Yeah.
Things Must Change won an Oscar, and Bob Dylan had a Nobel Prize for Literature. Who was the only other person to have an Oscar and a Nobel Prize? You just Googled it, haven't you?
No, I'm guessing Ronald Reagan.
No. I'm not going to string this out too long. I just thought it was something good to throw in at the beginning. And after 40 years of working in the media and journalism, you pick up a lot of crap. The other one, the only other person who ever has achieved that is George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw had an Oscar for an adaptation of the screenplay for Pygmalion. And of course, he had the Nobel Prize for Literature. Okay, moving on. Jeff, welcome. It's great. Really looking forward to having this chance to have a chat with you about this book, which I have read and thoroughly enjoyed, as is everybody else who I've come across who's read it. And we'll start with something that links. Obviously, there's going to be a lot that links the two. That's the whole point of the evening. But we'll start with one particular thing that links them in terms of popular perception.
Yeah, give it a whirl. The orchestral tune up first that pulled the two of them together in my head. And if you look closely at that, it says on the top, for Jeff, Peter Blake, because I'm lucky enough to call Peter Blake a friend. So when I came to be writing this book, and we had this title called The Two Dylans, and I needed a cover, Peter Blake had done a life-size figure of a tattooed lady called Tattooed Tina. And he made it full-size, sort of on cardboard, on plywood cut out, and it sold for many thousands. And then he made a print of it. That's one of the things that got me going.
So it was the two of them that brought it. One brought me to the other.
Well, it goes back further than that. So the first LP that I ever bought was Bob Dylan's first LP. In about 1964, this LP came out with a fresh-faced young 18-year-old with a black cap on his head. And I was into American blues a bit at the time, and then these boys around me in school, a bit older than me in school, were saying there's this guy called Bob. He's incredibly sort of bluesy songs, and he sounded 80, not 18. So I had that record, and I knew nothing about Dylan Thomas then. I was living in London, and so I bought that record, loved it, and then I bought the next level, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And then in the course of this, I heard that he actually had been born Robert Alun Zimmerman and had changed his name. And back then, they said he changed his name in homage to a Welsh poet. Well, my mother was Welsh, so I said to my mother, "Who's Dylan Thomas?" And she said, "Oh, well, he's a Welsh poet, and a biography has just come out." This is about 1967 then, and the Fitzgibbon biography had come out. And my mother said, "Go to the library and get the." She was a good reader, my mum, and so I got the Fitzgibbon biography and I read it, and it's a very romantic biography. But he also was a big drinker, Fitzgibbon, so he knew Dylan in the London pub, so he wasn't that great on the Welsh side. But in terms of a life that Fitzgibbon wrote, it ticked all the boxes for me. So from then on, the two went side by side. So that's what started it. And then it was things like this that made me think that, you know, the connection is more than just me. It's out there. You know, there is something going on. And Peter Blake told me that John Lennon chose Dylan Thomas for the cover, and Lennon was always my favorite Beatle, I think. So it all started to add to this. And so the two kind of in my life went along side by side. Obviously, when I became a bookseller and not a record seller, you know, a music shop, it was the Dylan Thomas that took precedence.
Yeah, you touched on the name, and that's worth emphasizing, because Bob Dylan claimed that he named him after a Welsh poet, but he also denied it as well.
So I don't think Bob Dylan, like a lot of artists, doesn't want to be seen to be beholden to anybody. So although early doors he told his girlfriend that it was Dylan Thomas, and people say who knew him that he would carry a copy of the collected poems around with him. Afterwards, he began to distance himself from and say, no, it was Matt Dillon off a TV cowboy show. It was an uncle called Dylan. It was a road in Hibbing, Minnesota called Dylan Avenue. He tried to put a distance between him. But what I talk about is, I don't know how I discovered, but I discovered that about 10 years into his career, just a bit less, a mate of his in New York called Steve Goodman was bringing out an LP called Somebody Else's Children. And he asked Bob Dylan to guest on it. Just do some backup vocals, play piano, guest on. Bob Dylan got there, those bars were folk clubs. And so the ambience in New York for Bob Dylan was pretty much like the ambience it was for Dylan Thomas. And it was that he was buying into. He was buying, you know, Dylan had died, this very public, it was pretty gothic to say the least. So I think they're the things that Bob Dylan took from him. You know, there's one, I think, in Spanish Boots and Spanish Leather, Bob Dylan sings about the chains in the sea. But, you know, that's not a difficult enough metaphor that means he copied it from Dylan Thomas. It could just be out there, maybe subconsciously. So there's nothing in the book that goes through lyrics and says, oh, this is based on this and this is that. It's much more about the shared passions. And someone did a review of it the other day that was very positive, and he liked the book, but he used the word tenuous. And I don't think any of the links I've written about are tenuous, but some of them I think are more to do with synchronicity or coincidence, but not when it happens, they're real, the things I found out. So that's what I feel about it. So yeah, I think the notion, I mean, what I think is interesting is that Dylan's father took so much trouble to name Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas's father took so much trouble to name him. When you think the name Dylan, it was not known in Wales at all at that time. And so he plucked it out of the Mabinogion, maybe, I mean, obviously it's in the Mabinogion, and I know that DJ had a copy of the Mabinogion because I bought some of his books and I had a Mabinogion with his signature in. They're in the National Library of Wales now. And he was a scholar of Welsh, but he picked this strange little story from the Mabinogion, you know, buried in, which book is it now? Anwin, is it the somewhere? So he dug that out of there, and then his second name he took from the great uncle Marlais. So he named his son straight into Welsh literature, it seems to me, you know, and his wife didn't like the name Dylan because she thought the kids in school, if they pronounced it the correct way, would call him Dylan, and he would be the dull one. And so but it was DJ who said, my boy is going to be Dylan Marlais Thomas. And when he was young, Dylan used to sign his books, Dylan Marlais Thomas, or sometimes just DMT, and all his early poems he called that. So the name was important to him. There is a story, do you know about Holbrook, the composer, who wrote an opera? Okay, so there was a composer who wrote an opera, and the libretto was written by...
Oh, Henry de Walden.
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
Howard de Walden.
Howard de
Walden wrote the libretto. And the libretto was called Dylan, Son of Wave. And it was an opera that toured. And just before Dylan was born, it played in Swansea. So this LP is out there. This opera is out there. It was published as a book. There's a big fag book called The Cauldron of Unwin. And just a separate section is just called Dylan, Son of Wave, an opera. And it's quite liable. There was a committee, Howard Warden had a committee to raise drama in Wales.
Yeah.
And DJ Thomas was on that committee. So maybe Dylan was from the Mabinogion, but then came into his head because of this opera. So the fact that DJ puts Dylan right into Welsh literature and mythology, that's what Bob Dylan bought into, from it being a Jewish boy in a Jewish town, you know, second generation from Eastern Europe. He's suddenly got a name that links him to, and I don't think he was unhappy with that. He did say when he was denying it on a few interviews, he actually says, you hear him saying, Bob Dylan says, make sure you tell him that's nothing to do with that Welsh poet. He actually says that in an interview. And then another time he said, I've done more for Dylan Thomas than he's ever done for me. I agree with that. I wouldn't be sitting here now. We wouldn't be sitting in, well, we might be sitting. The mere fact that after Dylan died very young, suddenly he gets a boost when this American, but if Bob Dylan had called himself Robert Auden or Tony Elliott, you know, I wouldn't be sitting here doing what I'm doing now and writing this book and doing all the stuff I've done for the last 50 years. So, you know, for me, I kind of look at it and I think, yeah, I know Dylan Thomas was a fine poet. I've never moved away from that. And he did live a short, lively life, and it got written up a good few times. But, you know, the mere fact that after his death, somebody like Richard Burton championed Dylan Thomas so much, and that kept.
How difficult was it in getting to grips with two men who played fast and loose for their own image?
Well, again, I think where it's necessary to mention those sort of things in the book, like the love of aliases, we do talk about in the book, and Keith talks about it with Dylan Thomas, Bob Dylan's, and I sort of go on there. But I don't know. I mean, I've always known that Bob Dylan is an enigma, and you know, never tells the truth about anything really. Every interview he's kind of knocking things sideways, you know, and Dylan Thomas, like you say, had that sort of tendency. I don't think it was a problem. At least I don't feel it was a problem. But you know, I think so. I first did something about the two Dylans in about 2000. And that was when there's a chap lives in Swansea, down the front, David Boucher. He's an academic. He's the professor of European history at Cardiff University. And he's crazy about Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen. And he's written books on them. So Dave Boucher is in Cardiff University. And for Bob Dylan's 70th birthday, he decides, so that makes it 11 years ago, he decided to have a birthday party for Bob in Cardiff. And he said, we're going to have a birthday party for Bob Dylan. And one of the things we're going to do is talk about Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas. And he got Michael Gray, who's the guy who's written a book called Song and Dance Man about Bob Dylan and written it 5 times. And it ends up being a Bob Dylan encyclopedia that thick with a CD-ROM in the back as well. And Michael Gray came over from France, where he lives. He's a tall man, sort of custard beard, written on Bob Dylan, known to be the expert. And he came, and he didn't believe the Bob Dylan, Dylan Thomas link at all when he came. But we did a show, we did it in Taliesin, we did it in Aberystwyth, we did it a good few times. You come and did the tech, didn't you? Lincoln, we went to Lincoln and did it. At different times, Michael was with us. Sometimes Dave Boucher brought a friend who teaches pop music at Liverpool University, and Danny Williams from the university plays saxophone, knows jazz, English professor. He came on the stage with it. So I was doing it back then. But back then, all I had was the name, which Michael Gray didn't. So in Michael Gray's big encyclopedia, there's no Dylan Thomas in the index. If he writes it again, there will be, because we've convinced him. Over the years, I've convinced him. Get them in Latin, I had the most points, so I got a prize. So on speech day, I could have a prize. And for the first year, they didn't pick the book for you. They gave you a book token to go and get a book. And I was, I think, 16, and I went to this bookshop and I got a copy of How by Alun Gibbard, little black and white book, City Lights book that had been banned and trials for it. Phenomenal poet, still unbelievable. And I never forget going up on the stage, and our old headmaster had a board on and a black thing, and he handed me this book, and I thought, if you knew what was inside that book, you would not be giving it to me now. So I was big. So the last poem in the book has got daughters in, and the T is dropped in the first edition and restored in a reprint. But it's not that there are 2 copies out that look like the first edition, but it's got the T in. So I checked that. I thought, this is good. First American, it's in a nice dust wrap. I can buy that. There's no price in it. You can buy it. And then I turned to the front and opened it. Alun Gibbard, New York, 1952. It was Alun Ginsberg's copy of Dylan's collected poems. And Dylan Thomas was actually looking for some sex action. He wanted to see a lesbian sex show, and they'd failed. And Caitlin had gone off. He was with him on that tour, and he asked Ginsberg whether he could get him to watch some women making love. And Ginsberg said, you can come back to your flat, my flat, we'll do the best we can. At the start of it, he had about 10 poems to read. And then the next night they said, could you cut it down to 8, Alan? Next time, could you cut it down to 4, Alan? Because they're having too much fun with the band. And there's in the film of the Rolling Stones, at one point, Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky, his boyfriend, who was also, or partner, who was also a poet, they're roadies. The poem ended up as the roadie. I'm not telling you, go straight, look it in your face. That's what happens when poets go on the tour with rock and roll bands. So yeah, the Ginsberg connection, to me, you know, back when we first did it, they were the 2 things we had. We didn't have anything else really. So I knew them when we started to look. Or what would happen, I think, because Dylan lived only for 39 years, and there are a dozen or more biographies of him of one kind or another. Great one of the last days in
absolutely
that Mr. Giddens over there gave us a long time ago, and still tells you things that none of the other biographies tell you. So those books are there. So almost for me, I could almost tell you, like almost. And when you look at Dylan's letters, Dylan Thomas's letters, there's 1,100 in the collected letters, no, 1,100 letters, and they're all dated and that. There are gaps, but you almost can find out what Dylan Thomas was doing every day of his life, you know, from about 20 onwards. So it was easy for me to know an awful lot about Dylan Thomas. So I would think what I knew about Dylan Thomas, having dealt in his books and dealt in his manuscripts and all that. And so I would think of somebody, and then I would use the internet and see if there was a connection with Bob Dylan. And if there was, I would just go to Keith and say, Keith, research. All right, so if I take Charlie Chaplin, right? I knew that Dylan Thomas had met Charlie Chaplin, because I was at a book fair in London once, big international book fair, dealers from all over the world, set it up, and a lot of business gets done when you're putting the books on your shelves, people are buying books. And my closest friend in the book trade, a little man called Eric Korn, he's dead now, great bookseller. He specialized in Charles Darwin and I specialized in Dylan, and we used to share a stand at American fairs, and we were really close. Anyway, I was putting my books on my shelves in a big hotel in London, the Russell Hotel, and Eric came walking towards me, and he had this green book in his hand, and he said, Jeff, you might like this, and if you don't want it, I'll probably buy it. And I just turned and looked. I said, oh, Eric, that's the American Selected Poems. I've got 3 copies of it. It hasn't got a dust wrapper. I don't want that book. You should look inside, he said. So I opened the book, and on the blank end paper there, it says, in a drunken hand, L.A., Los Angeles, with love and homage for Charlie Chaplin from Dylan Thomas, 1950, and it falls off the page. So it's the book that Dylan gave to Charlie Chaplin when he met him. So then I just Googled Bob Dylan, Charlie Chaplin, and up come all these stories about how he modeled himself on him in New York, and people used to call Bob Dylan Charlie, and he acted like the little tramp, and he loved the image of Charlie Chaplin. So then I just say to Keith, get your books out, do the work, you do Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas. So that's how the book went. I knew stuff from my side of the story. It was then, and sometimes I drew a blank. Sometimes I want to write about somebody because I had a great story for Dylan Thomas, but there was no comparative story for Bob Dylan. But in the end, we found, I think there's 20 odd chapters in the book, I think, something like that. And the guy used the word tenuous. I think they all stand a little bit of examination, but some of them are just coincidence. I'll tell you, you've not read it yet, so you might know, you might be the only person here who knows this. I was trying to write about, I'm not going to spoil the book, but I'll tell you a few things, but I was trying to write about the Beats, and I wanted to write about William Burroughs, the guy who wrote Naked Lunch. And Bob Dylan was very keen on him, but I could find nothing to link Dylan Thomas to, nothing. I looked in his letters. I think he mentioned once to Jack Kerouac, who's the poet, Kenneth Rexroth, ever published that article about Dylan Thomas and Charlie Parker? And the answer was yes, but that's about all Burroughs said in one letter to Kerouac. He asked that question. So I'm struggling. But I picked another biography off the shelf by Miles and started to look at it. And when Burroughs left his family in Kansas and went to New York, he got into heroin very quickly. And he was from a good family, wealthy family. And he found with his friends a dead doctor's prescription book. So they started to fake prescriptions for heroin, pure heroin, and go to the pharmacist, get the heroin, crank it up. And he misspelt the chemical word for heroin on one of the scripts he put in. And so the pharmacist called the FBI and said, I think this looks dodgy, especially because the bloody pad itself looked Victorian rather than current 1950s. And he was arrested, Burroughs, and thrown in jail. And his parents flew up to New York from Kansas, and the bail was set at $1,000, which was a lot of money then. And they didn't know their son was a budding junkie. And they didn't want to pay $1,000, and they were in a bit of a state. And they said, well, what can we do? And someone said, well, if you can get a dodgy doctor to say you were prescribing, he was prescribing it for medical reasons, and he'll be released. He'll still go to court, but he'll be released from jail. So they paid a doctor who wrote this up. And the same doctor, 7 or 8 years later, is the doctor who gave Dylan Thomas a grain and a half of morphine that killed him. So that was your connection. The guy, the doctor who sent Burroughs on his way, also sent Dylan Thomas on his way as well. So, you know, that's, and I found that, I think, by, and actually, I'll tell you, the name, what's the name of the doctor? It's a Jewish name, is it? I think.
Feldstein.
Feldstein. Feldstein or Feldstein?
Feldstein.
Feldstein, yeah. He, it was him who was it? So it's an unusual name. And Miles actually in the book, the biography, in parentheses said the same doctor who administered heroin to Dylan Thomas. So, you know, Miles knew this, but I'd never read it in that book. And I don't think any other biographer has read it. And you knew that end of life story as well as anyone, because that's what you focus on in your book. So and it's those kind of coincidences, just pure coincidence, really, but remarkable enough to make a story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You've pretty much gone through all the questions I had in my mind.
Sure.
So now I got to think of another one. You mentioned so many of the links, that they're in the book. There are some Welsh ones. I mean, W.H. Davis.
Yeah.
For me, not Idris Davis. Sorry, yeah. Idris Davis is an obvious one and a good one. That a Welshman.
Yeah. For me, I wrote the whole of the Idris Davis one, but Keith didn't do any of that because I'd written that before this book. So the book started. Keith had written a book called Bob Dylan in London, which I bought, which is a nice little book. And then he written another book called Bob Dylan in New York, which was just coming out. And a Tenby photographer who I know very well, his name's
Gareth P. Jones.
Gareth P. Jones, does a lot of photography down Pembrokeshire way for the council and for tourism places. He's a lively guy. He goes to New York every year and stays in the shop, or did stay in the Chelsea. He's nuts about Bob Dylan and nuts about Dylan Thomas. And he rang me up and he said, "Oh, I've got KG Miles coming for a drink in Tenby with me on the weekend. Come and join him." So I went over to Tenby and I meet this guy, Keith Miles. I've met him before. Gareth's there. I'm talking to Keith, and Keith, I said, "I'd like you Bob Dylan in New York book, in London. I'll get you New York one." I said, "How's it going?" He said, "Oh, I've got a 4-book deal with my publishers." I said, "Oh, what's the next one?" He said, "Well, I'm supposed to write Bob Dylan in Japan." And he said, "I'm struggling." He said, "I don't know anything." Well, it's Budokai is all you can do about Japan, one great concert. He said, "I've got nobody in Japan. I've got no background. I can't afford to fly there and research it." So that's a bit tough then. He said, and then he said, "What I'd really like to write," he said, "is a book about Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas." And I almost fell off my chair because, I just said to him, half that book exists on my computer already because of the stuff I'd done with Dave Bush earlier. And I'd also been looking at Bells of Rumney, the Idris Davis poem. So I wrote that chapter pretty much, that's all mine. It's because it was a story that I'd followed. And it's the only time where you could see that something that Dylan Thomas had moved a lyric that got to Bob Dylan, although he didn't write it. So Idris Davis wrote this long poem called Gwalia Deserter. It came out in a square blue book, exactly the same series as Dylan Thomas's 25 poems, grey, published by Dent. Gwalia Deserter, which translates as being the wasteland of Wales. It's like a response to T.S. Eliot in a way. Yeah, so it's called Gwalia Deserter. It's a long poem, takes the whole of this book. And Dylan Thomas was doing a radio program of Welsh poetry. It's collecting an anthology and reading them all on the radio. And he pulled one stanza from this long poem, which is the Bells of Rumney. Those couplets about mining disasters and coal miners and the depression. Wonderful, section. But Dylan Thomas pulled it out and read it. And when he read it on the radio, he said, "I'm now going to read a lovely song by," so that's what he said. And so after Dylan Thomas died, it came out in this country. The broadcast was put in quite early one morning, which is a sad little book, really, with a bad picture of him in the BBC on the cover and nothing to it. And Aaron Talvin Davis edits it, and but it's not a great book. When it came out in America, it was a fatter, bigger book with about half a dozen extra stories in. And it also came out originally with a beautiful black and white photo of Dylan leaning by Ronnie McKenna leaning against the boat shed door, but it had a wraparound a band over the top in red that said, contains a child's Christmas in Wales. So it was a really, compared to the English one, it looked a proper book. And Pete Seeger bought it. And Pete Seeger said that he was reading through it, reading the broadcast of Welsh poets, and he sees Bells of Rumney. He says Rimney because they don't know how to pronounce it. And he thinks of oranges and lemons, and he sets it to music. So Pete Seeger sets it to music. One way or another, very early on, it was being sung by a lot of folk musicians around the place. Shirley Collins was sung it on an LP, and Roger McGuinn of the Byrds was the engineer, and he heard the song and he took it back to Bob Dylan because they were doing Mr. Tambourine Man and all that. And so suddenly Bob Dylan makes a recording of the Bells of Rumney, and he made one recording in a room in Hibbing when he's very young, and then it's on one of the basement tapes with a band. So suddenly you've got a poem that is kind of buried in this country, really. And Idris was a great poet. T.S. Eliot established all of it. Idris only wrote 3 sort of slim-ish volumes of poems, but T.S. Eliot thought he was a really great poet, so they came out in very beautiful little wartime Faber and Faber books. And he was an interesting man. And the big edition of the letters of Dylan Thomas has got 2 letters by Dylan to Idris Davis, which are really great letters that weren't in, they came to light after this. So there was a real connection. And I think Dylan was going to Dylan Thomas was going to put a stage program on, a stage performance of Welsh poetry to raise money, and was putting the anthology together. And it writes to Idris about how he's going to include the Bells of Rumney in his stage thing as well. So, it's just a great story, I think.
Absolutely.
And then, you can go on, Mike Peters of the Alarm did a recording of it, and he reckons he's got all sorts of stories. So, a number of people who've sung that song.
It's deceptively simple, but just like Idris Davis's work anyway.
Yeah.
A lot of it.
No, and and then you see, and I don't know how I found this out. I've not got a good short-term memory, so I can't remember things that much. But I don't know if I got a hint. But anyway, on the back of the 3rd LP, Times They Are Changing. The back of that, there are something. It says something like 7 epitaphs by their poems by Bob Dylan. So at the back of the album, this black and white photo, a tiny little print of all these things. And at one point, in one of the poems, Bob Dylan writes a Bells of Rumney set in New York, with the rhyming couplets about what's happening here, exactly the same form, but it's New York and Los Angeles and San Juan, and so he obviously was aware of the shape of that poem. Whether Bob Dylan probably didn't know that Dylan Thomas had that much to do with it, but it was the vehicle that got it to America was the book that
Dylan's choice.
However, I told you all that. After the book came out, I was looking at Cwmdonkin Rees's anthology, modern British poetry, modern Welsh poetry, tiny little Faber anthology, but the first real edition of Anglo-Welsh poetry. And Cwmdonkin was a great editor. He edited the magazine Wales that ran for so many years in 3 different forms. But in his modern British poetry, Cwmdonkin actually just prints the Bells of Rumney before Dylan Thomas did. So I think that Dylan actually got it, not from Idris's work, and didn't find it himself in Gwalia Deserter, but knew he was very close with Cwmdonkin, so he would have got this anthology, and it predates his book. And I think it's Cwmdonkin who tried to make a book that represented Welsh poets, couldn't put the whole of Gwalia Deserter in because it was longer than, it's only a tiny little anthology. It's with great poems in it, all the great writers read it. He doesn't leave anybody out of that first flourishing of Anglo-Welsh writing, but he's just got the Bells of Rumney there with just, I think it stands at 14, so it just says X1V, the start. So there's no, it doesn't say bells of Romney or anything. So it's a great story. I think just if it didn't have anything to do with Dylan Thomas, the fact that that poem by Idris Davis became a global song, that's still, you know, an incredible song. It's a good story.
Yeah.
And you know, the fact that the birds sing it on an album, that's good as well.
Just to flag up that we're coming to questions and answers soon. So you on Zoom land, if you want to get some questions, and you in the room, start thinking. But before we do that, you want to end with another piece of music.
So yeah, the book's got lots of music in. I would like to let it come out with a CD in the back, but they're old fashioned now, aren't they? But we could put a playlist up in a way. There's a lot of music in it, and you know, there's links to Stravinsky, really important links to what's the other music we've got on it? Stravinsky. Tell me the others. There's some really good links. Johnny Ray. Johnny Ray. Amazing story about Johnny Ray. Read the book because it is a great story, the Johnny Ray story. The Stravinsky one you'd never know, and it's a really tight story. It's one of the ones that's got a lot going for it. And again, I knew the Dylan Thomas side of it, but then I discovered that it worked for Bob Dylan as well. So, but one of the chapters in there is John Cale, the musician just outside Swansea. And I think it's interesting because last week, Bob Dylan played Cardiff on Wednesday night and John Cale played Cardiff on Friday night. And I had tickets for both, but couldn't go on the Friday night. In the end, I had to give the tickets away.
Well, that's interesting. You get across it. That's quite interesting, isn't it? Because that's a kind of an echo.
I know.
Of Bob Dylan in Cardiff in 1966.
Sure.
And on the same day, Johnny Cash was in Cardiff on the same day.
Right. Yeah. I don't think Carl and Dylan had moved on because he was on a But I think it's remarkable those two musicians were in Cardiff in the same week. You know, stunning that because Carl doesn't come back that often.
No.
Bob comes, he plays Cardiff most times he comes over. So because of that, I thought we'd end with a John Cale version, somewhat different to the version that you gave us. But can you play that?
Do not go gentle into that good night. Only should burn and rage at the close of day. Range at the dying of the light. Met there and no dark is right.
That would be
Because
good.
there
Just a bit now.
was no light.
Good.
That takes you a completely different direction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That version.
He does the same with Heartbreak Hotel. He's very good, like Bob Dylan, in changing the shape of a song. So you think, hang on, I know this song. Do I? But he does a Heartbreak Hotel that's stunning as well. So, and that Do Not Go Gentle he did. It came out on an album that Brian Eno produced of Roxy Music fame to start with, but great producer. And it was called the Falkland Suite. He was a Paul John Cale, what he actually did at the Falklands. So made this album, and that was one of the songs. And he did a couple of other Dylan Thomas songs in the same album, set to music. So yeah, good.
There are questions. Let's start out in the big world.
Okay, a question from Stuart Stanton, who asked Jeff.
Sure.
Can we trace a line from Dylan through Ginsberg into Miles Davis, Coltrane, and then to Bob? It was all very New York and ended up altering the course of modern music. And also comment, I don't want to throw you off, but a comment. And who killed the miner? Say the Saturn, the blinder was the final line of
That's right. Yeah. in the book, there's stuff in the beat chapter. Kenneth Rexroth was the grandfather of the beat poets. He was older than them all, but he was in California, and he was an interesting writer, bit of a drinker too. And at the first reading of How, he was the MC when a group of beat writers got together in a gallery in New York, and was where How was first read by Ginsberg. Beat music, but beat scene with Dylan Thomas and Charlie Parker. So he saw that link between what Dylan Thomas was doing in New York when the jazz clubs were all open, and that. So yeah, Stuart, there is a good strong connection there.
Well, anybody in the room?
Yeah, sure. No questions in the room? Okay. Down to you. Okay.
No, they're all taking it all in.
There you go.
Absolutely.
How did you enjoy the concert? And
Me, I was gonna like it regardless.
Yeah.
I did like it. Yeah, to me, I've seen him about half a dozen times, and three of them he's been pretty appalling.
yeah,
But I still go back for more. And this time I thought it was great.
I thought it was great.
Yeah, I did too. I really liked it.
I'm a bit like Woodrow. I mean, you've no idea what the hell you're going to get.
No.
But actually, that he put heart and soul into it.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah. And I think it's weird. It's like a religious experience when you listen. It's a cult that goes to school. It's a benign cult, I think.
Yeah.
And the same is true. You know, I saw Nick Cave recently, and I should have seen John Cale, but my son went. But they attract a kind of following that's somewhat different to
You can see that by the audience, they were just demographing, you know.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like a good question, I said, and don't expect, let me tell you now, don't expect anything from him. You know, he's just going to get on and sing, might turn his back to you. Anyway, in between Don't Look Twice, It's All Right, he broke into waltzing Matilda. My son turned to me and said, what the fuck do you know? So, and I heard he just before he came to London, he played. When he did I'll Be Your Baby Tonight, he sang I'll Be Your Bébé Ce Soir, and the French crowd went crazy.
Yeah.
But that's what we do, we pick up little crumbs, you know, just because it's something. Some sort. But it doesn't matter because the way he reinterpreted those, and the fact that he did those songs off Rough and Rowdy Ways, which for a 8-year-old man is a pretty dazzling piece of work, I think. So yeah. I mean, it's just also crazy that he's lived twice as long as Dylan Thomas now. You know,
And the rest,
and still, you know, still producing incredible music, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff, Robin Taylor is asking, did you find any connection between Bob Dylan's apocalyptic visions and Dylan Thomas's poems about nature and the future of the human race?
No. Basically, Keith, who I wrote with, he's a lovely man, but there's a lot of Bob Dylan scholarship that goes down those kind of alleyways. And there's a lot of Dylan Thomas scholarship that goes down those alleyways. I'm not going to name names, but there are books out there that can put you off reading Dylan Thomas. And it's not. Christopher Ricks has written tons and tons about Bob Dylan as a poet, which is fine. You know, I do think he's a poet, but it's that kind of exegesis is not what I do, and it's not what Keith does. So you won't find any of that in the book. We'd like to hear, let him write the book that's on the comparisons in their lyricism. Heidman record label that was started by these two young girls because they were so impressed with Dylan's readings that they thought they had to go on vinyl. And they both had good jobs in publishing. They were young. They went to their publishers and said, look, we've got to do spoken word of this man. He's fantastic. And the word spoken word existed as recordings. There's recordings of James Joyce reading Ulysses and Winston Churchill's speeches and stuff. So there was spoken word. But these two girls saw Dylan and they then recorded their first LP, which is Charles Christmas in Wales on one side and 5 poems on the other. And it sold and it sold and it sold. And it's really what kept Dylan Thomas alive in America was that record, because radio stations used to play a Child's Christmas every Christmas Eve, and people would sit in their parlours and put the record on. So the fact of Dylan recording and being and they sold a lot. So they were both recording artists from that point of view.
And broadcasting as well as and in terms of he revolutionised performance poetry.
Dylan Thomas.
Dylan Thomas.
Yeah, I think he definitely sort of was brought back that bardic notion that poems should be read. And he made 2 television programs, but they both got wired, so we've never seen those. But the radio, he was a radio star, like endlessly.
What was going through my mind was, yes, we're blessed that we have Dylan reading his own work. And we're hugely blessed. And the Cwmdonkin collection at the time, 60, 70 years ago, I can see why they were enthralled and why they said we've got to put this down. But now that we're so familiar with it, sometimes it's good to hear Dylan's poetry not in his voice. And that's why I thought it was great that you did that. Because it takes us away from our perceived understanding. We think we know because we're hearing
Taxes. So he plays the Beatles, Mr. Taxman, and all songs with that. Towards the end of the program, and it's not in one of the set lists, it doesn't say it's there. Dylan just suddenly said, Bob Dylan now, here's a poem by a Welsh poet called Dylan Thomas. He wrote it for his father. And he reads Do Not Go Gentle. Makes no mention that it could be a poet who had any influence on him whatsoever. He just reads the poem and he reads it in his voice, grinds it out. I've got it. I can just touch my computer and hear it any day of the week. I've got it sort of on the screen so I can listen to it. But you can find it online. All the theme time radios are online. And if you go to Death and Taxes and you sort of scroll down near the end, there's Bob Dylan reading Do Not Go Gentle, which is quite a thing, really. So good.
Anyway, nobody else. There's so many chapters we haven't touched on. So the answer to that very simply is buy the book. Yeah, absolutely. There are kind of refreshments for those of us in the house, up in the living room, and copies of the book as well. And the book is easy to get hold of online.
See you on Zoom. See you, Stuart.